Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture 27 of course Climate Change and Extreme Events. In the previous lecture we have talked about primarily what is the socio-economic impact of climate extremes. We have largely covered multiple socio-economic impacts in a through different case studies. Then in the previous lecture we have talked about what is the social and health impact of climate extremes, which are waterborne diseases or cardiovascular or multiple areas where we have covered that this is the one of the more the particular type of impact which is posed by the climate extremes. We have also talked about when we are dealing with the climate extremes, it is not only the health or physical fitness of different living beings, it is also important to have a very detailed understanding of mental issues which is arise by climate extremes, post trauma disasters and all. So this is we have already covered, and we have also seen most of the time all of these catastrophes or vulnerable state of people who are living very closer to those countries which are still in developing phase, because we don't have or we have less amount of proper infrastructures to facilitate or provide the mitigation steps or adaptations steps to lesser the impact of climate extremes on those areas like that. So in this particular lecture we will primarily talk about vulnerability and adaptation in developing regions. Given the context of, let's say, we are talking about what is the socio-economic impacts, what is the health impact, what is the social impact, what is the the steps or vulnerabilities in those particularly developing regions. Here we are primarily talking about the lower income economies like that, how they are taking steps to mitigate climate extremes historically, and what they are doing for mitigating the climate extreme impact in the future time steps as well. So in this particular lecture we will talk about climate vulnerability in developing regions. We will identify key adaptation strategies. We will examine two case studies of successful adaptation of several adaptation measures, mitigation steps, particularly public engagement, public awareness programs like that, to lower down the impact of climate extreme, at least in those areas. And then we will also towards the end of this lecture discuss about challenges in implementation and funding, or how do we implement several different policies or different types of public engagement activities, so that at least we can aware them, and that is what are their challenges to implement in those areas like that. So what is vulnerability? Vulnerability is basically a mix of exposure, sensitivity and adaptive capacity. Vulnerability can be defined if we are talking about exposure, where we are talking about what is kind of exposure they have: rainfall, flooding, hurricane, or high velocity, high intensity winds, storm surges, or different population groups which are basically exposed to that types of disasters. What is their sensitivity, which means their financial capital, physical and mental changes, health and nutrition, aging, like these are the some of the parameters which we consider for sensitivity. And what is their adaptive capacity, risk perception, social capital and living engagement arrangement, psychological impacts, post trauma effect, educational attainment, what is the different types of awareness they have like that. If you talk about exposure, how do we measure of this component? Particularly we talk about different types of computer models or data set or different types of statistical model analysis like that. We can also talk about the past observations, we can talk about what is going to happen in future projections, that basically gives you an idea about what is the total exposure of that particular location. Or let us say we are talking about some census data set where we have information about age group, or where we have very sensitive age group living very close to a region which is frequently affected by riverine flooding or urban flooding, like that. What is their sensitivity? How we can measure? Primarily because of several economical factor, household income, what are their property values, persons with special registry or needs, like that, uh, what are their different doctoral visit there, or what is their aging strategy, or how do they manage these different groups of age in that particular regions. The adaptive capacity can be measures by self assessment of survey report primarily, or because of the some sort of census report, or primarily based on primary or secondary surveys, like that. So, that is basically we use those surveys, we use those census data to look at what is the present adaptive capacity of that particular region. And as the exposure is increasing, let us say hazard, proneness or intensity of rainfall or any particular climatic extreme disasters is increasing in the future steps, how our adaptive capacity is also changing over the time. So, these are some of the vulnerabilities terminologies we use for classifying whether a particular society is vulnerable or not, or let us say if we compare to some other different societies together or different areas per se, let us say in a one particular region, whether we have a more vulnerable region or a less vulnerable region, and how we can do different types of adaptation or mitigation steps for different types of regions, like that. There are vulnerability factors in developing regions, particularly if you talk about infrastructural vulnerability, that is basically linked to the infrastructural development projects, what kind of the agricultural techniques they are using, how advanced they are, because when we are talking about climate extremes, we are essentially talking about low or high extremes events. When you are talking about low extremes, we are essentially referring to those events where water has been significantly reduced, and that basically directly impacting the agriculture, or let us say if your high impact event, that is also going to affect the agricultural productivity. So, that is also matters when you are talking about vulnerability phase of the population, what kind of the advanced agricultural techniques they are using to support the populations of that particular regions, like that. Then what is the basic governance improvements? Let us say day by day, if it is the patterns, the historical patterns are changing, how they are making it sure that vulnerabilities or exposure should be reduced based on policy implementation or adaptation of certain measures, or updation of existing policies, something like that. Or let us say financial aid programs, post trauma or post disasters, what are their steps to reduce the vulnerabilities, providing financial assistance, or providing some sort of loans, or providing some sort of policies on based on certain the loss which occurred during a certain disasters, like that. So, these are the vulnerability factors we usually check when we are looking at particular developing nations. So, what kind of the climate risk in the developing regions can be possible? We have covered an entire range of extreme climatic events in the previous lectures, but some of them I am again summarizing. For example, if you talk about hurricanes, floods, cyclones, droughts, or if you are talking about let us say those events which are linked to sea level rise, that can be coastal erosion, loss of flora fauna, mangroves, forested areas, salinization of fresh water. So, saline water intrudes in the freshwater bodies, and that basically contaminate that area, so that you cannot use that water for household or some other purposes, like that. So, that is also post disaster effect in a certain regions, like that. when we have, or let us say food and water insecurities, when we have persistent drought conditions or longer drought conditions, it also basically affect the water scarcity and crop failure. That is the primary, some of the outcomes of these disasters like that. So, this is the map which we can see that most of the regions which are located in the southern eastern part of the world, if you look at. So, here these areas are primarily affected by flood events. But if you look at those areas which are close to the tropical and African regions, which are lower in economies, they are primarily affected by heat stress, water stress, drought conditions like that. But if you look at some other regions, for example, these Amazon areas and like that, those areas also affected by several different types of disasters linked to heat stress, which is wildfire, where we have a loss of biodiversities also. So, depends upon the location, geographical location of those developing economies or lower income economies, we have different types of climate extreme disasters, and therefore, it is possible that we should have a targeted or targeted mitigation steps for those regions which are falls in different types of or similar categories like that. So, this is one of the another figure which tells about when we have rising temperature, what is the repercussion of these rising temperature, increased heat stress, we have desertations, and then when we have increased heat stress, that basically directly impact the health risk, that is basically exacerbated by further energy driven needs. Then we have agricultural productivity decline, that is basically directly impacting the economics of those regions like that. So, what should be the adaptation strategies for those developing nations? Particularly if you talk about ecosystem based adaptation or natural based solutions, we can go to, let us say, non-structural measures or non-structural solutions for those regions, that is mangrove restoration. For example, we have to restore those biodiversity region where it was lost due to some sort of extreme events. Why it is important? Because restoring the mangroves, primarily if it is close to the coastal regions, it protects the coastal erosion and it enhances the biodiversities, because if you have more coastal erosion, it is might possible that in the future scenarios those areas will be likely to be inundated, because as we all know that sea level is rising, and because of the coastal erosion we are losing a substantial deltaic region. That is also exacerbated by another problem, which is sedimentation in the upstream of the regions, because we have building more and more dams in the rivers and like that, and sedimentations are happening in those regions, and therefore delta building processes are also affected. So, therefore, it is also very important to have a very correct understanding and the statistics of where we have mangroves, or how much mangroves or these forested or biodiversity region has been affected by different types of climate disasters. For example, Sundarban in those regions like that. Reforestation is another primary steps to basically we can restore the ecosystem, and we can provide some sort of adaptation measures, which is basically good for soil health as well as our carbon sinks. It is also very helpful for maintaining the surface temperature, because when we have more forested areas, that basically creates more evapotranspiration, that is a sort of a cooling effect, and therefore it tries to cool down the temperature of that region, and therefore we have less heat impact or heat stress in that regions like that. There are some other strategies, for example, agricultural strategies. We have looked at in the previous map that there are several low income economies where we have persistent drought issues. So, we can think about different drought resistant crops that can basically grow in a very little amount of water availability, and that can produce equal amount of crop yield compared to that seeds which requires large amount of water, surface water. So that might be a very good step further. We can we can deal with the food shortage issue in those regions like that. Or another issue, another strategies could be the efficient irrigation activities. How it works? When you're talking about, let's say, if you have abundant water, most of the time we have seen that people are using the flood irrigation. So they are completely flooding the whole area, and that is basically how they do that. This way we lose a substantial amount of water. So therefore, we can use some sort of efficient irrigation techniques, sprinkler system or some sort of optimized water use, so that we can minimize the losses, and we can provide the the amount of water to the plant, so that they can provide or produce the equal amount of crop yield compared to when we do that flood irrigations like that. So these are the some of the another strategies which is basically we can classify disaster preparedness and early warning system, which are very important. These basically the strategies deals with some sort of emergency services, training of local communities, community level preparedness plan, which we are also looking at strengthening the communication network, which is very important, and enhancing the weather monitoring, improving the data collection and forecasting of the capabilities like that. That is one of the strategies which we basically can improve further based on our early warning systems as well. Then another step is to building resilience in infrastructures. Most of the time we have seen the lower economies are suffered due to the infrastructure suffered due to some sort of climatic extremes. So we can look at in those areas flood resistance structures, storm resistance structures. We have better storm drainage system like that, so that we can evacuate most of the excess water during urban extreme rainfall, during the urban flooding conditions like that. Heat wave resistance, we have to think about making those areas or buildings where we have heat wave resistance structures, or maybe we can think about hybrid kind of urban growth, where we have equal amount of urban areas with the forested lands like that, so that they can make a balance between urban clusters as well as the forested land in between. Rainfall endurance, that is basically also constructing road, and that way basically that can handle the heavy rainfall conditions, and that the excess amount of water should not damage that infrastructure there like that. So now we will talk about some of the case studies of lower income developing economies, how they have implemented it and how they have got a very good results based on those strategies. So this is a case study one, which is Bangladesh cyclone preparedness. So primarily Bangladesh has we know that it's a cyclone affected region. Lots of cyclones encountered, or Bangladesh encounter a lot of cyclones every year and multiple years like that. So this is basically a severe weather conditions, historical cyclone events we have observed, and that is basically vulnerable for coastal populations, disasters, preparedness and response strategies like that. So Bangladesh has done some sort of community preparedness and resilience plan. What they have done, they have basically aware the public about how to handle the cyclone conditions if they are in the middle of that particular climate extremes. So they have developed some sort of cyclone preparedness and resilience, that is basically reduce that, lower down the mortality rates and increase the resilience. How they have done this? They have implemented the early warning system based on some forecasted values. They have predicted much before that, okay, this type of cyclone, what is their velocity, intensity and area coverage like that. Where should be our cyclone shelters? If the people who are living closer to the coastal region, those people can move to that shelters, and therefore the mortality rates can be lowered down effectively. Elevated homes, that is another some of the criteria they have done. Increased resilience, they have improved the infrastructures, community awareness program and climate change adaptation. So, how to deal all these basically to increase the resilience of the system. They have also to increase the awareness among the public or the people, they have done some sort of community training. They have made these early warning systems or advanced forecasting like that. They have also started cyclone shelters, that has really helped a lot, and therefore they have lowered down that mortality in if you compare to 1970s till 2010, but there are still many things needs to be done to improve further in terms of cyclone preparedness in this particular regions as well. There is another case study of water management in Kenya. These are the areas which are highly water stressed areas, and surface water and groundwater is a severe stress conditions because of already higher temperature, deforestation and different types of unsustainable human activities like that. So, Kenya has started water management challenges and strategies. They have reliance on the methods of vulnerable climate change, traditional agricultural practices. The droughts is one of the factors which basically affected the water availability. Climate change again, they exacerbated the whole problem of water scarcity, limited water availability and agricultural productivity, and therefore at the end you have food insecurity of that regions. So, they have started a community based rainwater harvesting system, that is basically the local water storage solution and empowering the local communities of how they can sustainably use the water available water resources for household purposes, so that they can lower down the loss of the surface water and groundwater, or not to extract too much of amount of water from ground, so that that would lead to another water stress conditions like that. They can also started thinking about drip irrigation system, that is efficient way to deliver the plants water. Conservation tillage, that is practice for soil moisture retention, and there is a training and support for farmers, so that they can educate, they can let them know about what should be the advanced technologies in terms of drought resistant seeds, irrigation strategies, or different types of agricultural methods, so that they can retain the soil moisture in the ground for a very long period of time, or maybe they can move towards the traditional methods of agricultural system, so that they can at least with the hybrid the traditional knowledge with some advanced understanding, they can tries to minimize the wastage of those water in that particular regions like that. What is the outcomes of this particularly? This enhanced climate resilience that has implemented the rainwater harvesting, that has improved the water security and increases the productivity yield in that particular region. And then primarily they have adopted all these things, and therefore they have tried to solve the problem of this agricultural productivity and water availability issues in the Kenya regions like that. So, that is one of the case study which tells about making community aware about certain steps, or let us say empowering the local communities and knowledge of traditional system with the advanced methodologies. We can basically manage the water in those areas where it is actually required, or for the lower income countries like that. What are the social and economical barriers to adaptation for those particular lower economies countries? Primarily the traditional practice hindering the adaptation, that is one issue. There is a community workshop and climate resilience, that is we need to do that, that is basically we can increase the awareness. Awareness campaigns in the school from the primary level, we should have full control on the students which are in a different schools and all, they should know before that any catastrophe should occur. And therefore, further the rural areas with the limited knowledge, that is also we need to increase that knowledge, so that we can have better understanding. What is the political and institutional gaps, challenges? So, there is some sort of policy gaps. Sometimes we have inadequate, outdated policies that hinder the effective climate planning. Lack of governance, that is another issue. Weak governance structures lead to fragmented adaptation efforts, and there is some sort of mismanagement. So, that mismanagement diverts resources away from one places or necessary adaptation steps, and that is basically can also affect political and institutional challenges in that particular regions like that. Then there is a poverty in inequality, for example, limited access to the resources and technology, agricultural productivity, resilience, homes, water saving technologies, limited access to financial support. For example, we can implement in those areas credit mechanism, insurance mechanism that basically supports the financial to the farmers and those areas which are basically low income peoples like that. Inequality in access, sometimes gender based inequalities can be a challenge, and that is we need to solve, and that is basically a barrier to adaptations as well. Racial inequality and exclusion from decision making, that is also one of the key challenges when we are applying certain policies to reduce the effect of climate change in those lower economies regions like that. What should be the financial and adaptation efforts? We have to think about this climate resilience force. We have to think about large scale projects which are can be made for climate extremes protections or structural solutions for climate extremes like that. And we can also rely upon international funding sources in those areas where we have these kind of challenges of implementations of like that. Vulnerable communities, community level projects and carbon marketing, these are the some of the adaptation and areas where we can work on and then can improve the conditions of those regions. There is a several funding authorities, for example, international donors, national government, regional projects, private sectors, or there are beneficiaries. So, these are the ways where we can get some sort of supports to implement policies or some sort of advanced technologies to those regions which are present in the lower economies and frequently affected by climatic extremes like that. And then there is a basically we can think about challenges in the funding distributions, and we can think about all of these barriers to remove and to basically to provide better funding to all of the people who are affected by extreme events or exposed to extreme events in those regions like that. So, what is the role of international cooperations? If you talk about UNFCCC, this is a global agreement adaptation committee, and they have multiple international mechanism, for example, Warsaw, financial support they provide, and they have done some sort of Paris agreement guidance and adaptation they provide, support for loss and damages, and then they have also provide green climate fund that is basically supports the developing economies like that. Regional cooperation in the climate adaptation can be also be enhanced resilience, knowledge sharing, that is basically also work with the joint initiatives and then providing using the regional climate funds by enhancing all these different steps like that. There is a private sector's role in climate adaptation. For example, they invest technological innovations, they provide expertise, knowledge and skills, renewable energies, insurance and infrastructure projects like that. So, what would be the future direction of the adaptation? Primarily we have to look at local governance, participatory decision making bodies and capacity building programs, so that we can have a better strengthening of the local government. We can implement satellite technology or advanced technologies for data collections, early warning system, resource allocations or proactive measures. And then we can integrating the indigenous knowledge with the advanced technologies, so that we can have indigenous agricultural practices, water conservation methods, natural resource management and cultural relevance in those particular regions, so that we can mitigate the impact of climate extremes in those lower economies regions. So, in this particular lecture we have primarily covered vulnerabilities of developing economies, developing regions, what are and how they are basically stems from different socioeconomic and environmental factors. We have talked about adaptation strategies through different case studies, how they have done this in their region, and what context specific or targeted adaptation strategies are needed for different local economies like that. The third important thing we have learned from this particular lecture is financial and institutional supports plays a very critical role in managing the long term effect of climate extremes in a particular regions like that. If we have robust financial system, that basically helps us to lower down the impact of climate extremes in that particular regions like that. So, in the next lecture we will talk about what we have covered so far in week 9, and there is a one assignment we will do, and the next lecture we will discuss about how to solve that assignment. Thank you so much for your attention.